Hi guys. So it looks like Dominic Raab probably drew the shortest straw because he was on Sky News to defend the government's position regarding the new tiered system, which is going to be rolled out on the 2nd of December. And he was also there to play down the likelihood of a Tory backbench rebellion to the restrictions and to the lockdown in general. So let's hear what he had to say.
70 Conservative MPs have voiced their anger at the tier system of COVID restrictions that will replace the national lockdown in England next week. The Prime Minister has been forced to make a number of concessions already, including offering MPs another vote on it in the new year. Well, joining us now is the Foreign Secretary, Dominic Raab. Thank you very much for being here in the studio. There's a real depth of anger, isn't there, on the Conservative benches about this new tier system. Are you a bit worried you might lose this vote?
Well, look, I think we've got a confident message that we need to explain and listen as well. The reality is we want to come out of national lockdown.
Okay, so he's ignoring the question. Are you worried about this vote? Well, he could just be honest and say, no, I'm not, because the Labour Party will come to our aid. Now, he doesn't also have to be worried about this rebellion because it's quite small at the moment. It is growing, and it could become a big problem at the next vote, which is, as Boris Johnson has promised, next year, the early next year. That could be a different situation for Boris Johnson. Now, as Keir Starmer is his knight in shining armour at the moment, that may not always be the case. Keir Starmer is under a lot of pressure within his own party not to just go along with the government. Many people within the Labour Party are concerned about being blamed for the disaster that Boris Johnson is conducting at the moment. So I think, yes, at the moment, there's nothing to worry about. You know, he has the support of the Labour Party, but that's not going to be guaranteed in the future.
And stay out of it. There is hope, there is light at the end of the tunnel with the prospect, subject to regulatory approval, of the vaccine being ready to be in place and distributed by the spring, which will allow real step change back to life resembling normal.
Okay, I wish people like this would stop delivering false hope, because, and look, I think we need to look at this at the science. We have to look at it from the scientific point of view. So he's saying that probably, you know, we're going to be back to normal in spring. Remember, Boris Johnson said we'd be back to normal at Christmas. So whatever Boris Johnson says, you know, you have to take away a pinch of salt. This is a bigger issue here. This idea that, okay, as soon as we have the vaccine, we'll be back to normal. That's not the case, because according to the science, it takes between 2 to 3 weeks for any vaccine to be fully effective, to have the body recreate or to create antibodies to help fight the virus. So you're talking 2 to 3 weeks for it to be effective. Now, how long will it take to roll out this vaccine? Dominic Raab and the government have talked about, first of all, NHS frontline staff will be immunised. Okay, but that's one aspect. What about the general population? How long is it going to take to immunise the entire population, or enough of the population so that you have a reasonable level of herd immunity? If it says, let's be very generous and say it takes a month. So you're talking about a month after the beginning of the rollout, and then you're talking about at least at the end of that rollout, you're talking another 2 to 3 weeks. So let's say 2 months. We're talking about another 2 months of restrictions. You need to impose the restrictions for another 2 months. I don't know if Boris Johnson's party will go along with that. Of course, he's not telling them this now because they would hit the roof. But I think you need to be honest with the public. Now, I'm being extremely optimistic by saying that it could take a month to roll out this vaccination program. We have no idea how long it will take. It could take months. It could take a year. I know the army is going to be involved, so that should help, speed up the process. But immunization programs normally take months or years to be fully rolled out. This, I don't think, is going to be that much of an exception. Yes, it will be. There'll be a huge amount of political and financial will to get this thing going as fast as possible. I don't know how long it could take. Maybe it could take a month. Maybe it could take more.
The two things we need between now and then are this tiered approach so that we can target the virus where it's the most dangerous. We are starting with a more restrictive approach than previously with a localised approach, but that allows us to ease up when we're confident the virus is going down and is stabilised. There's a review every 2 weeks. The second thing is just the testing.
I just want to say something about this review every 2 weeks. Sage has said that a 2-week window is too short. It takes up to at least a month before you start to see the real results of any measures that you put in place. Why is Boris Johnson giving this review every 2 weeks? Well, it's a political choice because he doesn't want to leave MPs hanging for too long, because they will get angry and the rebellion will grow. So I'm sure every 2 weeks he's going to say, we're doing a great job, we're getting these numbers down, everything is hunky-dory.
And what we've seen, we've had 12 million people tested, and we've seen in Liverpool with the community-wide testing at scale done more quickly, that really helps us bear down the virus. Those two things are the crucial bridge to that light at the end of the tunnel in the spring.
At the same time, though, no one's arguing that there shouldn't be any restrictions. What people are worried about is that these particular restrictions under the tier system are not fair. And you can see why people feel that,
And this is very important. They have to be fair. They have to be seen as fair, because if they're not seen as fair, then people will not follow them. Now, I have a bigger problem with this. Excuse me. I have a bigger problem with this. My fear is that it's not only that they're not fair, but that the restrictions don't stop people from moving from one tier to the other. In some cases, the tiers are separated by a border, a county border. And you have villages, you have homes very close to the border. Now, somebody could be living in tier 2 and their neighbour is living in tier 3. And we're talking about maybe 100 yards of a difference. There's no restriction on them meeting. For the tier 3 person there is, for the tier 2 person there isn't. The restrictions are different. But also people are free to move from one tier to the other. What's the point in having restrictions on people meeting, going to bars or restaurants in tier 3 if people are still able to cross the border and profit from the benefits of the tier 2 area? It just doesn't make any sense to me.
Lancaster City Council, for example, lower infection rate than every single one of the London boroughs, but that is in tier 3 and London ends up in tier 2. How is that fair?
Well, there's 5 criteria that we're looking at and that are being applied, not just for the initial tiering, but as we go through. And as I said, there's a review every 2 weeks. It's the prevalence of the virus, the prevalence amidst the over 60s, the testing rate, the positivity testing rate, the impact on the NHS, and all of these things need to be looked at the round. And
so how many, just to break that down, so you've got 5 things. How many of those things need to be over a certain level, for example, to be put into tier 3? What is the criteria? Well,
it's the 5 principles, and ultimately it's also a question of judgment. So
he's not going to explain, and I've talked about this before, you need to be transparent with the public. Explain, okay, if the NHS arrives at 50% or let's say 80% capacity, this is one of the triggers. Then if the R number is above 1, this is another trigger. And explain it to the public. You don't have to be a scientist, but you know what the criteria is. If you explain the criteria to people, then they're more likely to trust you. If you don't explain, then they're not going to trust you. If you just say, well, we have these criteria and we're not going to tell you what they are, or in a roundabout way, we're not going to tell you what they are, then how do you get people on your side?
Just to give you an example, because I know it, and I've
so had it judgment raised. Doesn't sound like it is really a firm system, does it?
Well, it's a balance between being so prescriptive that people say it's rigid and you can't take into account the holistic impact in an area. But let me give you an example. One of the things that we realised is that where you've got low levels in a particular area, but it's surrounded by others with higher levels, and I think the West Midlands is a good example of that, Dudley and other areas, if you don't apply on a wider level, which is why we're using the county-wide basis, the same restrictions, all that happens is the virus in those lower level, if you like, enclaves, goes up exponentially.
So just to come back on that then.
But then people are free to move from one county to the other. Yes, the enclave will, the numbers will start to increase in the enclave. But if people are able to move from tier 3 into tier 2, just walking across the border or driving their car, then they're going to spread the pandemic into that tier 2 area.
You've seen that happen in places like Kent, for example, where the whole of Kent is put into higher restrictions because of a few pockets of high levels. Why hasn't it happened in London, where you've got some boroughs with really very high infection rate rates, and yet the whole of London is in tier 2?
Well, as I said, you've got to look at the 5 principles. And one of the other things, and I know Michael Gove was talking about this over the weekend, is just making sure that the NHS, and that will depend on the capacity and the pressures in those local areas, is able to cope. But this is about bridging through.
Okay, but so this could be a valid argument, but I wish he would have gone into more detail about this, because I think it would have actually helped his position if he had said, "Look, in Kent, there's a risk at the moment that the NHS in that area will be overwhelmed, while in London they have much more spare capacity. So there's a less, while the number of new cases in London is higher, the risk to the NHS is lower because there are more hospitals, or they have access to more resources, or whatever." That's the way you'd need to present it. I don't know if that's the case. I don't know if the NHS in London is better prepared, has more capacity than in the likes of Kent, for example. But I think Dominic Raab needs to explain this to people, because by trying to work around the language, I think he's just making it more confusing to the public, and I think he's undermining public trust in the institutions, in the government, and in the NHS at the end of the day. Something very worrying here in Italy is that the public haven't just lost trust in the government, they've also lost trust in the medical profession. Not all, but some people are losing trust in the medical profession, which is extremely dangerous, because it's not the medical profession who's at fault if the government fail. It's the government itself. Let me know in the comments section, guys, what you thought about all of this. As always, your comments are greatly appreciated. Thanks a lot.